In the next apartment, something is still happening that can't be explained. I have been hearing sounds there for the 4th day, but no one can make them as the apartment is empty. There's absolutely no one inside. I'm scared. An adult, 24-year-old man is sitting in the farthest corner of the room, trembling like a girl. As soon as someone runs through the next apartment or lightly knocks on the wall. A few days ago, I witnessed a terrible story that happened, let's say, in the next apartment. I will probably start from the very beginning so that everyone who listens to this story would understand what has happened. I was lucky enough to rent an apartment in this area, in this house and entrance. I didn't earn so much money, and I didn't have rich parents to buy me an apartment, even the smallest and oldest one. That's why I had to wander around the city in search of normal and not expensive living conditions. Probably every story of this kind begins in the same way. A person rents an apartment in which the devil knows what begins to happen. But that is not my case. There isn't a drop of fiction and exaggeration in my story, and these inexplicable things happened not in my apartment, but in the next one. But I'll tell you about it a little later. I have been living within these walls for almost a year now. It would have been a year in June. During this time, I managed to make the apartment very comfortable. The apartment has ceased to be similar to what I rented a year ago. It has become much cozier, warmer, and in general, it has been filled with life and good energy. I managed to get acquainted not with all, but with most of the neighbors. Some pensioners living on the floor below were extremely untalkative. Only sometimes they sat silently on the benches at the entrance, and they couldn't even open their mouths to say hello when I greeted them with a strange smile. I don't like such people, and old age is not an excuse for this. A woman and her son lived across the wall from me, the complete opposite of the characters described earlier. A friendly woman constantly treated me to fresh pies, always greeted me, and even when terrible fatigue was red on her face after a working day, she smiled, and there wasn't a day she wouldn't say hello to me. It was understandable. Once, over a cup of tea, she told me about her difficult fate, about her husband who died in terrible agony, about how difficult it is to raise a son alone. In general, she complained and cried into my not particularly strong male shoulder. I'll say right away, the woman was already at a decent age and didn't expect anything you could think about. We had good neighborly communication and nothing else. I also made friends with her son. In my opinion, he only came home to spend the night and eat. I saw him on the street all the time. There are a lot of children in our yard. They all ran around the playground for days, and on the roofs of garages next to the house. In general, the most ordinary, hyperactive, and very funny boys. Actually, as you have already understood, the story will be about the woman Elizabeth and her son Stefan. Then, it was already a warm April Monday. It was already getting dark as I was returning home from work. I was tired, as if I've been working hard for a week, and I saw lots of kids running on an improvised football team, chasing the ball, shouting at each other. Well, this generation still has a chance to be normal, I thought to myself, smiling, realizing that after all, not all children now live with phones and the internet. Of course, a proper upbringing is very important, so I went up to the entrance, lit a cigarette, and heard a strong rumble from the road and saw the headlights. It was clear that someone drove into the yard. I will never forget what I saw next. A ball flew out onto the road. One of the boys ran after it, and suddenly, a car rushed out from around the corner. I subconsciously threw out a cigarette and rushed in that direction, even despite a decent distance, but I didn't have enough time. Suddenly, I heard a blow. The car skidded, and it turned over, hitting and knocking down a post. Only when I ran up there, I realized that Stefan had been hit with a post. His body was lying under a sparkling post, and all the house was abruptly blacked out. It was warm outside. The windows were open. So many people heard the blow, heard the screams of other children, and ran out into the yard. For sure, Elizabeth was among them. I rushed to pull out the driver in the first seconds, but I only had to look at what happened to him to give up this idea. He was trapped in the cabin, so that it seemed at any moment his upper body would fall off from the lower one. The blow was very strong. Only God knows why he was driving so fast. In a few minutes, half of the yard ran to the scene, and soon the ambulance, police, and the rescuers arrived in a hurry. Elizabeth immediately realized what had happened, Anne, who was lying under the post. She was getting hysterical. She rushed to the boy's body and tried to pull him out. The rescuers tried to explain to her that it wasn't so easy to get him out of there, but she didn't seem to hear anyone. I understood her. I myself felt so disgusted that I couldn't talk to anyone. 2 lives were cut off in an instant, and what was even worse, one of them was almost at the very beginning. In general, I didn't leave the woman's side all evening and night. Being shocked, a person can do anything. I tried to control it, tried to calm her down in every way I could, but it was all in vain. No words could help in such a situation. The police talked to the witnesses for a long time. The rescuers tried to cut and move the post in order to get the boy's body out from under it. People slowly dispersed in some time. Only Elizabeth and I stood next to each other and watched all this, and a couple more people from our entrance. The body was soon taken out and loaded into an ambulance. He was still bleeding. In the abdominal area, there was a bloody mess of organs, blood, and crushed bones. I couldn't look at this for a long time. That's all I remember. Stefan was taken immediately to the morgue. I allocated money from my deferred salary so that I could help the woman with the funeral, since they didn't live very richy. We spent the whole night at her flat. She kissed photos of her son and kept silent. Only when she fell asleep in the morning, I allowed myself to go to my housing. Obviously, I couldn't fall asleep after what I saw. There was a funeral a day later. Elizabeth couldn't cry anymore. All the tears had left her eyes. She just kept holding his photo in her hand all the time. And again, she didn't talk to anyone. She just thanked me for the money I helped with. The days went on as usual. The situation is certainly bad and sad, but I couldn't quit my job, quit my business, and my life because of my neighbor and her loss. I just took a couple of days off at my own expense just to help with the funeral. Then I went back to work. The clock was ticking. Home, work, work, home. And so the days of my youth passed, so to speak. I haven't seen Lisa. I returned late at night and left early in the morning. And so, on the weekend, I decided to visit her to find out how she was doing. She didn't look like herself. A completely different person opened the door for me. She leaned out from behind the door and looked at me with tired, sleepy eyes. "Liza, are you all right?" She just nodded. "May I come in?" "No need," she said, as if she came to her senses. "There is a mess inside." "Well, as you wish." I was surprised and glanced at the floor in the hallway. Yes, it was really dirty there. Either the earth or some grass was scattered. "Just let me know if you need anything. You are always welcome. I'll treat you to some tea and cookies." I smiled absurdly. "Thank you." I will definitely come by. She also smiled affectedly. Over the following weekend, I watched a woman gradually go crazy. She flatly refused to let me come to her, although earlier when Stefan was alive, she invited me to visit, even despite the mess in the apartment, and she has been behaving extremely strangely lately. Sometimes I could hear her voice through the wall. She talked to herself, sometimes even laughed. I also heard quick steps, as if she was running around the apartment, but such conversations and the earth that I saw in her corridor a few days ago pushed me to bad thoughts, and my guesses were confirmed when soon I began to feel a distinct smell of rotten meat leaving the apartment, and I wasn't the only one who began to feel it. In the first days, it was still possible to think that it just seemed to us, but in the following days, the smell became more and more distinct, and after a week, the stench became unbearable. I tried to reach her, but no one opened the door for me, and she didn't answer the phone calls, although I could still hear her behind the wall. She was obviously at home. Other neighbors also didn't give up trying to reach her, since from the first days, it was clear that the stench came out of her apartment. They have already tried to call the police, but she didn't open the door to them either. The police shrugged their shoulders, as they didn't have the right to just break down the door and get into the apartment. The thoughts that Elizabeth dug up her dead son from the grave and dragged him home were confirmed a few days later when I was walking home from work. I approached the entrance and noticed the light in the dark from a cigarette. "Hi, Max." "Good evening." It was Mr. Saunders, one of those taciturn pensioners about whom I spoke at the beginning of the story. It was extremely strange that he greeted me first. Usually, he paid absolutely no attention to me. "I heard your neighbor's son was hit by a car." "Yeah," I answered, taking out a cigarette from the pack. Suddenly, the old man took a few quick steps towards me and said, "It's not good to dig up the dead from the grave." I also dropped the cigarette from my hand. "The dead?" "Yes, the dead. I saw her dragging a huge bag home at night, and the next day I had to sweep the earth in the entrance. I'm sure it was from the cemetery. Now the stench in the entrance is unbearable. Time has passed, and the weather is warm, so the body is decomposing. She might have suffocated in the apartment. She couldn't accept death," he said, throwing away the cigarette butt. "You've been good with her, haven't you?" "Well, yes. The dead don't like it when their bodies are taken out from the grave. The soul hasn't yet flown away." Suddenly, he came even closer to me, and he spoke so quickly. "Be careful, Max. What is sitting in her apartment is no longer her son." I looked at him stupidly and asked, "Do you think there's a dead man there?" "It's not a dead man. She brought evil to her apartment, not understanding what she was doing." "And how do you know all this?" "I have already encountered this. My aunt, who lost her husband, also dug him up in the cemetery and dragged him home. She had lost her mind. She took care of him, changed his clothes, bathed him, fed him, as if not noticing that the body was decomposing. And then there started a real devilry. She found her husband's body in different places, although he was constantly sitting in one chair with her. She heard footsteps at night, the creaking of doors, and many other things." My neighbor lit another cigarette and continued, "At first we thought she definitely went crazy. Then we didn't know that there was a dead man in her house. She came to us, told us that her husband had returned, that he hadn't died, and the doctors had made a mistake, and she flatly wouldn't let anyone into the house. But my son-in-law and I still looked through the window in the evening. Of course, we were horrified. Indeed, the already half-decomposing body was sitting on a chair, and she was running around it, and the stench was so strong that it hurt my eyes. And then As she was taken away to the insane asylum and the corpse was reburied, something began to happen in the house. I lived there for a while and really heard footsteps at night, such a slow creaking of old floorboards and the same doors. His story gave me goosebumps all over my body. I stood like a statue and listened to the interlocutor. I thought it was a dream, but when I saw him outside the window, just as decaying, I crossed myself, took all my property, and immediately left the house. I didn't return there again. Apparently, the dead man came home. I don't know what he needed there, but he looked and behaved extremely unfriendly. I'm afraid we'll have the same story here, but I don't know when. Should I call the police to say that she dug up a dead man and keeps him at home? Try it, but I don't think it will work, because I've already seen them come. Yes, but they didn't know such details. I'll call them right now. Be careful, and it's also better to call the priest. Definitely. Thank you. I went into the entrance, and the man followed me. The terrible stench prevented me from breathing, so I had to cover my nose with a t-shirt. I called the police, and after describing the whole situation, they sent a patrol to our address. They arrived surprisingly quickly. I met the police, and after explaining to them what was going on, we went up to our floor. They rang and knocked on the door for a long time, but no one answered. And finally, when one of the policemen threatened to break down the door, we heard footsteps in the hallway and the rattle of a key in the keyhole. Elizabeth opened the door, and we noticed that the woman looked horrible. She seemed to have lost 20 kilograms. Her sunken eyes and a face pale as a toadstool poked out from behind the door, following the disgusting corpse smell. The policemen had already moved away from the apartment and were covering their mouths and noses with their hands. One of them couldn't stand it and abruptly opened the door and said,
"Woman, excuse me, we'll go in."
She also tried in every possible way to push away the officers, but what could a little old lady do against two hefty men? We entered the apartment. Flies were everywhere. There were innumerable of them, and in one of the rooms, we found what a neighbor had told me about. There was a boy sitting at the table. I immediately recognized him as Stefan. The already swollen skin burst in some places. Worms crawled all over it. The eyelids looked like they were sewn on so that the eyes would never close. He was neatly dressed and sat as if alive. The horror and disgust that I experienced then can't be described in words. Frankly speaking, the police officers were also shocked by this scene. Since Liza jumped in hysterics and tried to hit the policeman, she had to be handcuffed. In general, the boy's corpse was taken away, and as I understood, they reburied it. All this was done without my presence. Liza was sent to a mental hospital for examination. What started to happen next still doesn't fit in my head. The neighboring apartment was sealed, and for a long time, no one lived there or even entered there. I started hearing footsteps outside the wall at night. Distinct, quick steps, as if someone was running on the old floor. One of these nights I woke up. My mouth was terribly dry, and I went to the kitchen to drink water. I walked and really heard footsteps in the next apartment. At first, I didn't understand. I thought I had been dreaming yet, but when I listened and later put my ear to the wall, I realized that I wasn't imagining anything. There was really someone behind the wall. I opened the front door and looked out into the entrance. The neighboring apartment was still sealed, and the seal wasn't broken. But then, who was there inside? I ran home and locked the door with all the locks. Was the neighbor right? How can this be true? But then, it got worse. The next day I came home and found scattered earth everywhere, even on my bed. There was earth mixed with dry grass all over the apartment. Once again, My whole body was covered with goosebumps from misunderstanding what was happening and fear, such as I had never experienced in my life. That night, I again heard rapid footsteps behind the wall, once again trying to install the idea that this is all my imagination. I got out of bed and went to the wall, and without knowing why, I slightly knocked on it. All my conjectures that it was my imagination were completely dispelled when I heard a knock in response from the neighboring apartment. I already jumped away from the wall, and I felt my heart pounding hard in my chest. Quickly getting dressed, I ran out of the apartment and ran to visit Mr. Saunders. For a long time, I was standing at his door, knocking and ringing, until finally, after 10 minutes, the door opened and the old man's face appeared behind it. "There is something," I tried to say, gulping for air, but the old man understood me in half a word, opened the door wider, and let me into the apartment. "I heard footsteps behind the wall. I was a fool to knock on it, and I was knocked back." "Why did you knock?" "I thought it seemed to me, Mr. Saunders, and yesterday I found the earth in my apartment, scattered everywhere, both on the bed and on the floor, and even on the nightstand." "Bad, very bad," Grandfather said, walking into another room. "What could it be, Mr. Saunders?" "What could it be? A kid came to see you." "But why didn't he choose me?" "You called the police, didn't you? So you are the one who separated mother and son." Everything became clear to me. "Here you go." The old man handed me a huge cross and a small book, apparently with prayers. "So, go back home. Don't be afraid of anything. Go around every corner of the apartment and say a prayer. Do you understand me?" "Got it. And will it help?" "It should help. Prayer always helps." I ran home, already on the move. I opened the little book and read to myself everything that was written there. When I entered the apartment, I again found earth in my hallway and small dirty footprints. As soon as I turned on the light, my heart almost stopped. Stefan was sitting at the kitchen table, still in the same clothes as the last time I saw him. He sat and didn't move, looking at me with his bleary eyes. I gripped the cross tightly in my hands, and despite the incredible horror, I began to read prayers just as Mr. Saunders had told me. I looked first at the little book, then at him, and I can swear by anything that every time I looked at him, his position changed. The hands were lying differently, then the head was turned to the side, and the eyes were opening and closing. After the prayer was read, objects from the shelves and lockers began to fall down. Dishes flew to the floor, paintings and photographs fell from the walls. But all this didn't happen for long, not long for me. After I ran around all the corners of the apartment, no matter what, except for the kitchen, of course, and did as Mr. Saunders ordered. I left the apartment without even locking the door. I spent the night with a friend who lives on the other side of the city. In the morning, I returned home, and except for the same cemetery earth and things scattered all over the apartment, I found nothing. It took me a whole day to pack everything I needed and leave, and for the whole day, I only heard how someone was running around on the creaking floor and knocking on the wall in the next apartment. Calling the owners, I said that I had urgent business and I needed to leave. I gave the keys and moved out of the apartment, hoping never to see the swollen corpse sitting at the table again.